Hey, and welcome to episode 9 of Think Like a Hacker. We've got a jam-packed news segment for you today with Kathy Zant, and then we've got an awesome conversation that I had with Jon Brown, who is the CEO of 9 Seeds. Get ready for an amazing podcast. All right, welcome to episode 9 of Think Like a Hacker. Kathy, how are you doing?
Doing great. Recovering from WordCamp OC. Did you have fun?
Yeah, it was awesome. Nice to see all our friends, huh?
Yeah, it was always a good time.
Yeah, so it was my first WordCamp OC, and I was at WordCamp LA last year, and I saw a lot of people that I first met at WordCamp LA last year, so it's kind of like a reunion. And yeah, it was really pleasant, and it sounds like it went very well, and we had an amazing WordCamp. So, but yeah, let's dive straight into the news. So we have a jam-packed news segment for you today, and we're going to try to cover everything diligently, but get through it, in a timely fashion. The first story we've got here is that there is a WordPress plugin with a vulnerability. Surprise, surprise. The plugin is WooCommerce Checkout Manager, which is not WooCommerce itself. It's an extension that adds capabilities to WooCommerce. It's made by, you might pronounce it, Visser Labs in the United States. This actually based in Australia, where I come from. You pronounce that Visser Labs. And the plugin has 60,000 installs, so not a small plugin. And what the plugin does is it customizes and manages fields on checkout pages. And this is an arbitrary file upload vulnerability. The plugin was removed from the repository by the maintainers last Friday, on April 26th, the Friday that just passed, and it's now been restored. We checked it today, which is Monday, April 29th. And the issue there was that the plugin's categorize uploaded files option was not checking privileges or permissions before the files are uploaded. As a result, bad actors, hackers, that kind of thing, could upload and then execute malicious files. I chatted with our threat intelligence team about this, and they tell me that the plugin needs a specific option checked to make it vulnerable. A researcher published a proof of concept last week, and I think it was on Tuesday that researcher did that. So that makes it easier for a hacker to exploit the plugin because they can just use that code to attack sites. We investigated and found 3 more vulnerable endpoints on the plugin. So after this was reported, we had a closer look ourselves and found more issues, and we worked with the developer to fix those as well. Obviously, we work with them confidentially, and the developer has fixed all the vulnerabilities that we found, including the one that another researcher found, and the plugin is back in the repository. And what's kind of nice about this is that the changelog notes that the security issue is fixed, and it's always nice to see that, isn't it, Kathy?
Yeah, definitely. It was very good the way that was all handled.
Yeah, I think some developers, and it's usually individuals or less experienced teams, will not put a note in the changelog saying that a security issue was fixed, and that really doesn't do a service to the user community, because they just think it's a regular release and there's no urgency attached to it. So putting a note in the changelog that you fixed a security issue, if you're a developer, is always really, really great. And then, as if that wasn't enough, I guess BuddyPress released a bunch of security fixes, Kathy?
Yeah, BuddyPress had an announcement. BuddyPress has installed on over 200,000 WordPress sites. And their announcement actually is, when I took a look at it, it came out on April 25th last week. And this one not only went over all of the security issues, but gave a thanks to all of the security researchers who had responsibly disclosed those vulnerabilities to them. The bulk of them are privilege escalation vulnerabilities, but there are a couple cross-site scripting vulnerabilities that were fixed as well. There was one in particular that was bad, which was a privilege escalation vulnerability that could allow users to view private message threads that they didn't have access to while using a Nouveau template pack. But those are all fixed. So if you're using BuddyPress, definitely make sure it's updated.
Kathy, I guess WordPress 5.2 is coming out on May 7th now. Was that date pushed back for some reason?
Yeah, it was pushed back just because there were so many track tickets that were open and they wanted to make sure that most of those issues were handled. But there's a lot of interesting things that are coming with WordPress 5.2. There's going to be some improvements to the Gutenberg block editor, which I'm sure everyone is coming to love as we're using it more and more. There's a new administrative interface for site health checks that we've talked about on the podcast before. The fatal error recovery mode. That is a new feature that is going to pause themes causing a fatal error. So it's going to, if there's an update that occurs and that actually has a problem, it can often white screen the whole site, which is why we always recommend that you do updates first on a staging server just to make sure everything's okay. But this is actually going to pause plugins and themes that are causing fatal errors, which would normally cause those white screens. So it's going to send an admin an email letting them know that the site is having problems. An administrator would click on a link in that email, taking them to the site, giving them a session cookie to access the site, and then they can fix the issue and exit a recovery mode. 5.2 also has accessibility improvements on the WP admin side for assistive technologies. So if you're accessing your WP admin using an assistive technology, there's going to be improvements to accessibility. And it's going to make it easier to customize WordPress's included privacy page. This was added in a previous release, but it's just going to make it easier to customize that. And one fun thing that's been added, Johnny Harris, who's a contributor, added an embedded Giphy images into the block editor. So people are very excited about having fun, with the Giphy images, being able to add those to WordPress. So it'll start looking more and more like, I guess, a Twitter feed, huh, Mark?
Yeah, I guess I'm not that hip, as you know. Is Giphy? I guess it's a library of GIFs that you can use, and is that where Twitter gets their GIFs from?
Yeah. Twitter actually pulls them from a number of different GIF libraries, and so they're going to pull Giphy into the Gutenberg block editor and just make that accessible in there. So just fun stuff. Like when I went to OC, I had to do like a few Arrested Development on Twitter just to have fun because it's going to Orange County, right? So
I like I said, I'm a nerd, and I saw you guys reference this a lot. So what's the connection between Arrested Development and Orange County? Is it like?
Yeah, well, it took place there. So there were,
okay.
like one of the characters would go to Fashion Island and
spend all
of her money.
I mean, it falls flat when you have to explain the joke to the guy who's just totally ignorant, right? But
we had fun with it.
So 5.2, I think the most interesting thing there is the white screen that WordPress can suffer from is known as the white screen of death. And it's what happens when you have a really bad PHP error, usually on the back end. And so the intention here is to help with that. So not totally trash a site if something crashes, but just disable it. And the way it works, the flow is that the admin gets an email, they can click on a link which gives them a session which authenticates them into the site, and they get into the site. They click the link, they arrive on the site's now in safe mode, and they can then do diagnostics and so on. And in safe mode, the thing that caused the issue has been disabled. And so once the admin has finished doing their thing and hopefully fixing the site, once they exit safe mode, everything is re-enabled and hopefully the site's not going to crash this time. So they're trying to lessen your need for a developer is a sort of short version of that. But yeah, and so we're paying real special attention to that because we are a plugin developer, of course, and we want to make sure that our plugin interacts with this correctly. And we also want to make sure that there's no way for an attacker to leverage this to disable WordFence. So Matt Rusnak from our team has been paying attention to this, and I think he's been contributing to the conversation on track about this. So WordPress 5.2 drops on May 7th currently, and hopefully they'll stick to that date. All right, the next story we've got here is another dark web marketplace bites the dust, and this one is the Wall Street Market, or WSM. And I guess what caught my eye about this story is the pattern that is repeating is the creators of the market, or the guys who run the market, exit scammed, which means that they they took all the money and left, and you're never going to hear from them again. And so what happened there is the administrators of the site, of this dark market where drugs and weapons and that kind of thing are traded, claimed that the site was having trouble, and the specific trouble that they said they're having is that their Bitcoin wallet was not syncing with the blockchain, and days went by as they were supposedly trying to fix this, but meanwhile what they're actually doing is taking money, transferring it from the site's wallet to their own wallets. And this pattern of doing that is so common that the users of the site started saying, oh, you're exit scamming. And of course, that's exactly what they were doing. So they pretty much drained the bank account and headed for the hills. And the support staff of WSM are actually blackmailing the customers now. They're demanding about $280 in Bitcoin, or they will release the customer Bitcoin address to the authorities. And as if that's not enough, one of the WSM moderators shared their own credentials online, which gives the entire internet access to the site's back end. And so it's an absolute dumpster fire. And I guess the lesson here is that, and the reason I'm including the story is that, there are these dark markets out there where you can supposedly buy, drugs and guns and that kind of thing. Well, not supposedly, you can actually buy them. And if you are ever tempted to use one of these markets, just don't. Just save yourself, from doing that, because this kind of pattern repeats continuously. And this market, the thinking among researchers is that it shut down because Dream Market, which is another dark market, announced that it's shutting down recently, and I think it's shutting down on April 30th. And the day that they announced that they're shutting down, the Europol, FBI, and DEA announced multiple arrests, double figures in arrests, and they were targeting drug trafficking on the web. And this was possibly related to Dream Market. So the thinking is that the guys from the Wall Street market decided that the business that they're in is too risky, so they'll just steal all their customers' money and abscond with it. So that's what's going on in the dark market space. And if you're ever tempted to use one of them, just don't. So, but Kathy, I guess we've got a follow up on our Sensorvault story from last week. Do you want to update us on what's going on there?
Yeah, well, we reported about the New York Times article about Google's Sensorvault, which is a geographic database containing data on users and their locations. Last week, ZDNet, Catalan Simpanu, reported that Congress is actually interested in this as well. So they sent a letter to Google for details on Sensorvault's location tracking database. The problem is that law enforcement can ask Google to examine data in a specific geofenced area. Google then reveals that data on specific suspects that match law enforcement's criteria. So Congress is asking Google how that data is being used, if more entities outside of law enforcement are benefiting from this extensive database, and they're asking if the company is running similar location tracking databases in other areas. The number of employees who have access to such a wealth of personal data is also very interesting to Congress.
Yeah, and I think this is a good move. I think that these are the right kinds of questions to ask. I think that Google is so big now; they're basically a systemic risk in some ways, and having the government step in and say, hey, what are you collecting? How are you using it? Who has access to it? And that kind of thing. I think it's a good move. What do you think, Kathy?
I definitely think it's a good move. Google not only has access to everything you're doing if you're using an Android phone, but you're probably using Gmail, Google Docs, searching for information on the internet. They can really have a full profile of what you're doing interfacing with the internet, what sites you're visiting, because I think pretty much every site out there is using some kind of Google Analytics, and that information is all aggregated in the Googleverse. It's like a universe unto itself. So definitely good to start asking some hard questions. Is Google overreaching, and is law enforcement access to this information overreaching any kind of civil liberties, I suppose?
Yeah. And speaking of user data and the aggregation of user data, We've got a really interesting story on Russia Today, which is not one of my favorite news sources. They're funded by the Russian government, and I have a bit of an admission to make. I was one of their guests about a year ago. We published some research. Actually, maybe it was more like 2 years ago, but we published some research, and it supported the message that they're pushing, which didn't really occur to me at the time, but they were interested in chatting with me, and I regrettably went and chatted with RT on a live interview. But yeah, and I won't do that again. And they've since asked, and I don't think I'll go back. But they do have some interesting guests from time to time, but they do certainly push the Russian government's message in a pretty big way. So. But one of their recent guests was someone who is a real luminary in our space and in the open source community, and that's Richard Stallman. And Richard has a really cool history. If a lot of people know who he is, but in case you don't, he actually wrote the GPL, and the GPL is the license that WordPress is based on, and that many, many, many other open source projects are based on as well. And he also wrote Emacs, which is a extremely popular editor. It's one of the two main editors that Unix and Linux folks use, the other one being VI. So Stallman wrote Emacs. He also founded the Free Software Foundation, launched the GNU project in 1983 to create a free Unix-like operating system. And then later on, the tools that he created were combined with Linus Torvalds' operating system, which is Linux, to create Linux. Or Stallman kind of insists that people call it GNU Linux because they're sort of such an integral part of each other, and Torvalds disagrees with that, but I'm not sure we want to get into that debate right now. But Stallman is a really, really interesting guy. He's been a huge contributor and kind of the creator of the modern open source community and movement. And he was on RT on Russia Today, or I think they used to be called Russia Today. They're called RT now, and he did an interview. And the interview is great. He's talking about Facebook and about the sort of surveillance engine that Facebook is. And some of the notable parts of his interview is he basically calls Facebook a surveillance engine, doesn't think that Facebook should exist. He says, and this is something that really resonated with me, is that the only thing about Facebook that is useful is their ability to help you get in contact with people. Stallman says in his interview that once those people are in contact with each other, then at that point they should be able to choose what method of communication they want to use. And I thought that was so insightful. I think that Stallman thinks about the way the world should be doing things, but he thinks about them in an algorithmic way. And what he's done there is he's really identified the specific, the main value that Facebook offers, and the thing that it does that we might not be able to do without, or that adds a heck of a lot of value. And the rest of what Facebook does is insists on having you communicate via their platform or share data via their platform so that they can get as much of your data as they can, because it empowers them to monetize that data. And I think that was just such a great point. It really resonated with me. Stallman suggests that the government should run a service that Facebook the service that he says Facebook is really valuable for, and that is the ability to have people contact each other. So he thinks that Facebook should be replaced by the government, basically. He describes the business model of Facebook is to get people to give Facebook data. He says that Facebook doesn't have users; it has useds, and I think that's I think that's true, to be honest with you. Yeah. Facebook can discover if you're pregnant or gay, for example. And in some countries, you can get killed if the state discovers that you're gay. We've chatted a lot about this on our podcast in the past. And obviously, I'm not a huge fan of Facebook. I left the platform some time ago. I think most of my team are still on Facebook, and my friends and so on. I included this story because I really would encourage you to go and watch Stallman's interview. Richard Stallman is... he has a lot of mileage. He's been around in the open source community and thinking about open source and the ways that humans interact and use software, and how software should be created, distributed, licensed in particular. And then also about data. He's been thinking about this stuff for a long time. And so to have someone like that go on to television, RT in this case, and have a conversation about this kind of thing is really insightful. It's a little bit like watching Warren Buffett talk about investment. It's just someone who's been who's done some really significant things and been thinking about this for a very long time. So we'll include the link to the YouTube video in the show notes, and I would encourage you to check that out. And one last comment on Stallman's interview there. He was talking about Mark Zuckerberg's manifesto regarding creating a privacy-focused organization. And I thought this was really interesting. He points out that Facebook can't create a privacy-focused platform because, for example, Australia made a law claiming the power to punish anyone in the world who refuses a secret demand to sabotage the privacy of a communication system. That would include any Facebook employee. And so while they're claiming that they want to create a privacy-focused organization, they actually don't have the ability to do that because governments have the ability to compel them to not keep that data private. And so even if they have the best of intentions, it's just not feasible to get there. And I think that was a really insightful point. But anyway, moving on, JetBlue is playing with facial recognition, it sounds like, Kathy.
It does. Interestingly, I caught wind of this from Edward Snowden's Twitter account, and there was a chain of a conversation between someone who had flown on JetBlue and JetBlue's Twitter account itself. And what the story was reported on Boston Herald, that those tweets have subsequently been deleted. But the story was reported on April 27th on Saturday by the Boston Herald. So basically what they've found is that JetBlue is using facial recognition instead of boarding passes to identify passengers for boarding, which sounds super convenient, I suppose, but the passenger who was asking questions of the JetBlue Twitter account was very surprised and argued that they did not consent to this, and it just sort of took them aback that who had the facial recognition database that JetBlue was using. So the person asked the company how they were using this, and JetBlue responded, the information is provided by the United States Department of Homeland Security from their, quote, existing holdings. So there is a facial recognition database, apparently. JetBlue went on to say that these photos aren't provided to us, but are securely transmitted to the Customs and Border Protection database. JetBlue does not have direct access to the photos and doesn't store them. So it appears they're using an API for this feature. A recent Department of Homeland Security report said that the agency is working towards a full implementation of facial recognition technology within the next 4 years. And they estimate it will account for over 97% of departing commercial air travelers from the United States. So they use this technology when you exit the United States. And they say that since its inception, over 2 million passengers on over 15,000 flights have used the technology on exit with an average biometric match rate of 98%. So these photos are coming from passport applications, visa applications, or interactions with the CBP at a prior border encounter. So they create a gallery of faces for a particular flight, and they use that facial recognition to match a passenger on a known flight against the flight gallery of faces. So it's a little Orwellian for me, for my tastes. I'd prefer to have a passport that was in my hands and just, it's interesting to me that a corporation is being brought into this interaction that, now they're just saying that, they're not storing any of this, but they're saying that. How do we know that? How do they know how do we know how this information is being transmitted? Are these secure channels? So it just opens up sort of this Pandora's box of what do governments and corporations know about us and how are they using this information? And it just has a weird feel. We're going to be traveling to WordCamp Europe. Are we going to be going through the same kind of situation when we head over there?
Oh yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that'll be
but
fun.
Kathy, I guess I'm a bit confused. Why are you uncomfortable with this? Do you have something to hide?
I have absolutely nothing to hide, but governments make mistakes, corporations make mistakes, information is stored and is hacked into. I don't necessarily, I don't, if I can't sort of ascertain how information is being stored, transmitted, and used, and who has access to that, I just trust the system. You can't trust the system without proving that, right?
Yeah, I think there's also something that's kind of personal about your face, right? It's like it's my face, it's not your face. You don't get to have it and identify me
Yeah,
with it and so on. So there's just something deeply personal about facial recognition. So it has that natural kind of discomfort level from the get-go,
sure.
and then you have the conversation about and what is happening with the data. Is it secure? Is it going to be used for marketing purposes by JetBlue as they intercept the API requests that are going to CBP? Who knows? I guess we'll see
Is
how it
Mark
evolves.
Zuckerberg
Is Mark Zuckerberg going to get hold of it? Yeah, exactly.
is that actually going to be what Facebook was intended for? Now, obviously, the metaphor of Facebook has all taken us by storm.
Yeah, for sure. Anyway, interesting story to see how CBP is evolving and how they're using technology to authenticate people and identify people and so on. But yeah, the next story is GoDaddy taking down 15,000 subdomains that were being used for online scams. And GoDaddy reset the passwords for several hundred compromised accounts. The story there is that these accounts were being used to create subdomains, and attackers were using those subdomains for affiliate marketing campaigns and scammy websites and spammy websites and that kind of thing. Some of the websites were marketing brain supplements. Some of them were marketing CBD oil, weight loss pills, other dietary products. It was a 2-year investigation, and the researcher there was who was the researcher behind that, Kathy? Was it
Yeah, that was Jeff White from Palo Alto Networks.
okay? Yeah, great. And it looks like he did a 2-year investigation. The scammer group used either phishing or credential stuffing attacks to gain access to GoDaddy's customer accounts. Now, just to clarify, credential stuffing attacks are attacks that where the attacker is using breached credentials to try to log into, in this case, GoDaddy accounts. And that's a little bit different just from a brute force attack, which uses random passwords. The breach credential attacks are a lot scarier because they're using a password that you've used somewhere else to try to log into your GoDaddy account. So if you're using the same password across multiple systems, you're going to get caught in one of these, especially if you don't have two-factor authentication enabled. So they use credential stuffing to get in, and the operators of the scam would create a subdomain for the customer's legitimate sites, which they then later use to host one of the shady product promo pages and lure users with email spam campaigns. We've cleaned sites like this, and we've seen the kind of spam that these folks use the compromised sites for. But this looks like it was a fairly large campaign and a fairly large number of breached accounts, and then a total of 15,000 subdomains created through those breached accounts. So GoDaddy has taken care of that, and Jeff White's blog post about this is a fascinating look at how a security researcher uses pattern recognition in order to uncover malicious actors. So we'll include a link to that in the show notes. And yeah, interesting story, and really nice to hear that GoDaddy was proactive there, Kathy?
Yeah, definitely. And I have cleaned those sites. I'm like, oh, I've seen these sites. I remember this. So this was kind of, it was kind of cool to see just, I just anecdotally had seen just a few of these sites and had seen GoDaddy credentials, not just a hosting account, not just the hosting account, but the whole DNS, the entire GoDaddy account had been compromised. And so for him to actually have seen the pattern of like what had happened across the board was really cool to read.
Yeah, and it sounds like he worked closely with GoDaddy to take these accounts offline,
Yeah.
which is always nice to see a researcher handling things correctly. So that's really great. But yeah, moving on. Over 2 million Internet of Things or IoT devices are vulnerable apparently because of peer-to-peer component flaws. And the story here is that over 2 million IoT devices, possibly more, are using a vulnerable P2P firmware component that allows hackers to locate and take over impacted systems. These devices include IP cameras, baby monitors, smart doorbells, DVRs, and more. The vendors include HiChip, Tenvis, SV3C, VStarCam, WansCam, NeoCoolCam, SriCam, iSight, and HVCam. These vendors are all using a component in their firmware called iLink P2P, and that allows the devices to talk to vendor servers via P2P. There's two vulnerabilities. The first allows attackers to locate the devices, and the next lets them intercept connections to the devices and steal credentials. We'll post the CVEs in the show notes so you can look at the specifics of those credentials. But the lesson here, in thinking about this, it's a tough one. To be honest, the only lesson I have is to minimize your use of IoT, because we have seen so many IoT devices that are just cheap junk that's rapidly launched with very little security and horrendous vulnerabilities. Some of those IoT devices have been used as botnets, as in the case of surveillance cameras. And I would just take an audit of what IoT devices you have in your home, whether it's cameras that let you look at your garage over the internet, or a thermostat or something like that. Make sure that the systems are up to date. If there's a firmware update available, definitely update those IoT devices, and just don't get any more. Do you should I ask you if you have any IoT devices, Kathy, or is that going to be painting a giant target on your back?
Yeah, I cannot. Well, the house we're renting actually had a security issue. And so the people who lived here before had a number of security things in place. So one of those things is a Ring doorbell. So we've been using that just to see, what it was like. And, that camera's facing out instead of being in. So I don't feel too weird about it. But yeah, I don't think I would have any kind of cameras inside my house. I don't do the Alexa thing. I don't do any kind of, I already know the phone's listening to me. So that's bad enough, right?
Yeah. Well, I have a great mitigation tool for you. It's about $15 down at Home Depot, called a Sledgehammer.
I'll work on that.
Cool. So it sounds like Docker got themselves into a little bit of trouble, eh?
Oh my gosh, yeah. This was 190,000 accounts. That's a lot of accounts. So this story was widely reported. The article we'll be linking to is at motherboard.vice.com. So Docker Hub lost keys and tokens for around 190,000 accounts. So Docker is basically a container that allows developers to run software packages. And this is used by, there's a number of different types of containers that different developers can use. Docker is probably, I think it's the number one containerization type of tool that developers use to develop applications. Companies such as PayPal, Facebook, Google, Splunk, Atlassian, are all listed as Docker users. So this loss of keys and tokens, it potentially gives hackers access to the private code repositories for all of these companies. Now, I don't know if this is, PayPal was compromised here or any of these other companies were compromised, but 190,000 accounts were. So we'll have to just assume that some major companies were compromised in this case. It gave hackers also the ability to inject malicious code into software that was auto-built by Docker. So just to give sort of an analogy of what this is like. So think of an apartment building, and each developer's container is kind of like an apartment, and the keys and tokens are for that particular, they've gotten a key for the apartment. And this is kind of like the apartment manager has has all of the keys for all of the apartments. And this is kind of the same type of thing. So the risk is that hackers could bypass two-factor authentication on the code repository, GitHub, using the stolen keys and access tokens. So potentially this could be catastrophically bad, but we don't know that anything bad has happened. We're just aware that this risk does exist.
Yeah, this is nuts. What
Yeah.
really caught my eye here is those two things that you mentioned. The fact that they can use a GitHub token to remotely access GitHub repositories from the Docker compromise, bypassing GitHub's 2FA. That's
Mm.
one really scary thing. And then the other thing is the kind of supply chain attack that they can launch by injecting malicious code into software that is auto-built by Docker. They've got access to that build process and to that code, and so they could have potentially had malicious code released in the name of one of these customers. The customers including, as you mentioned, PayPal, Facebook, Google, Splunk, Atlassian, and so on. Scary, huh?
Very scary. Yeah, but I mean, what's our thinking like a hacker,
Right.
right?
Well,
We have to think like we
well,
have to.
what's the mitigation here is the question. I mean, it's not the old go ahead and enable 2FA because this is a bypass for GitHub's 2FA
Right,
for starters.
right.
So
Yeah.
stop writing software and head for the hills.
Has-
Disconnect from the internet. But yeah, this is a bad one. I think it's going to be interesting to see how Docker recovers from this, eh?
Yeah, it'll definitely. It's something to watch for sure. Using the cloud though, and using containers and using tools like GitHub, that's not going to go away. It's created so many different ways for developers to have efficient workflows. It's just we all have to be aware of the security risks of not working on a computer that you like bury 6 feet underground when you go to sleep at night. It's part of our life now, right?
Yeah, yeah. I wonder if they might start re-architecting these source repositories that contain private code, and that private code is obviously extremely valuable intellectual property belonging to these
Yeah.
companies. And it's also very important that that code doesn't get modified by a hacker. I wonder if they'll start looking at ways to encrypt that code and then only have it accessible by the owner of the code using when that owner wants to actually access the code and needs to work on it. And so the owner will keep the keys to the code uh, with themselves and will authenticate, perhaps using public-private key encryption and authentication, or something like that. So basically, you'll end if the attacker breaches a database like this, all they have access to is the encrypted code. They don't have the keys to that encrypted code. So I wonder if Docker and these companies will start exploring that kind of thing.
That's very interesting. That very clever.
I guess we'll see. I guess we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then Slack is they haven't IPO'd yet, have they? They're getting ready, aren't they?
They're getting ready. They just had their sort of a disclosure because they're getting ready for the IPO. They have like other companies that have had breaches and then want to IPO. They have to disclose that they've had a breach in the past. So it was an interesting disclosure that they had to the SEC in their filing that basically not only talked about the intrusion that they had in March 2015, but they talked about the potential for the future. It looks like they believe that they are a target for nation state hacking. And this article was on motherboard.vice.com as well. And as I mentioned, they are concerned that they are a target for very sophisticated attacks. Think Stuxnet level type of attacks, organized crime, nation state malicious actors. But also, like everyone, they are vulnerable to lower sophistication attacks, threats from traditional computer hackers, malicious code, malware, viruses, worms, ransomware. Also, employee theft, misuse, password spraying, phishing, credential stuffing, and even denial of service attacks. These threats are impossible to entirely mitigate, says Slack in their IPO disclosure, and so they're just wanting investors to be aware of the risks. So as I mentioned, in March of 2015, Slack did have a breach. For 4 days, an unknown person or group of people had access to Slack information, including usernames, email addresses, encrypted passwords, and phone numbers stored by the company. Slack did introduce two-factor authentication after that, following that incident. Interestingly, Slack does not have end-to-end encryption. So it's important to realize that even though it feels like a very natural, secure place to have conversations, you're still typing into the cloud. It is possible if your company, for example, has the corporate export feature enabled on Slack's Plus plan, they can download all of the content that is resident on that Slack account.
And I think that just demonstrates that they're storing all of that stuff in plain text, and Slack does not have end-to-end encryption between folks that are communicating with each other.
Right.
You are typing something into Slack, it is being stored in a database on their systems. So if those systems are compromised, then that data is there for the attacker. Now, I don't think that we're sounding the alarm by any stretch of the imagination here. I think that this is really standard. Slack is preparing to go public, and they need to let they're required to let the public know about all risks associated with their company, and these are very realistic risks that are associated with them. And I guess if they're breached by a government or someone else, they can point to the filing and say, "Well, we told you." So you can't see them over that. But yeah, I've always thought the corporate export feature that they have is interesting and a little creepy. We don't have that enabled, and we won't ever enable it, I don't think. But the idea that if the company that you work for uses this feature, they can export the contents of private channels and the contents of direct messages. And so, if you're a Slack user, probably just something to keep in mind. But Slack is a really great platform, and we certainly live and die by it. Much of our company culture is based around Slack. We're 100% remote, as I'm sure you all know, and we're huge fans. So yeah, just some interesting data on them. But Kathy, I think that's about it. That's a wrap for a rather long news segment, eh?
That was a lot of news. Lots going on.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And today's interview is a conversation I had with Jon Brown, the CEO of 9 Seeds. Jon is based in beautiful Idyllwild, California, and we chatted at my friend Chris and Katie Bayer's coffee roastery. I chatted with Jon about running an agency, remote work, being a digital nomad, and of course WordPress. We had a great conversation, and I think you'll really enjoy it. So here's Jon Brown from 9 Seeds.
So hi, I'm Jon Brown. I run an agency called 9 Seeds. I'm also a full-time digital nomad, which means I run my agency while I travel the world. Our whole team is remote, but I'm the only one who never lives in the same place for more than a month or two. But I'm joining you today in a little town called Idyllwild, California, where is kind of my home base of sorts. I've known this town for 40 years now. And my WordPress story, I started coming out of, I was actually a civil engineer. I left engineering to travel for a while, fell in love with travel, tried to make a career out of photography. And one of my photography clients hired me to do a website, and it was a WordPress website. And from then on, it was all WordPress all the time, because that enabled me to travel all the time. And in the last 10 years, that's allowed me to live in Asia for a while, Thailand, Bali, live in Italy, live in Spain, live in the US, Austin, Texas, Southern California, all over the place. One of the most special, though, was Maui, and a lot of people know me from there. I moved there from Southern California, started the Maui WordPress meetup group. If you're ever on Maui, do drop by once a month. And then after 4 years of growing that community, managed to organize as lead organizer the first ever WordCamp Maui. Still the WordCamp of all of the WordCamps in the world I've been to, my favorite, but then I was organizer, so it's not really fair, but it was really a magical WordCamp. And I get people all the time who are like, when are you going to do the next one? And the answer is always like, I don't know, someday when I move back there, because I went back to being a full-time nomad and I can't really organize it from the road. So if you're ever on Maui, do check it out though.
Awesome. And we are chatting outside Chris and Katie Bayer's amazing coffee shop. It's Black Mountain Coffee Roasting in Idyllwild. Do you have, so you've been a digital nomad for some time now. I mean, do you have challenges accessing bandwidth and that kind of thing?
No, there is some stuff that goes into that. So I should say I've been location independent since 2006, so 13, 14 years. And used that to live here in Idyllwild for a while, used that to live in Maui for a while, and have used that for 5 or 10 of those years to be a full-time nomad living in Italy and Spain and all over the world. The interesting thing happened a few years ago. We traveled to the Caribbean for the first time, my wife and I. And it was really anxiety ridden because I've been traveling so much in Southeast Asia that I knew no matter where I traveled in Southeast Asia, I knew if I found a problem with bandwidth and comfort working, like I couldn't find a co-working space, I couldn't find a good cafe, bandwidth was terrible, I knew where I could escape to within an hour and find it. But the first time in a new region, I had no idea. Like I was like, we're in the Dominican Republic, and if I can't find bandwidth, I don't know what I'm to do. And I think it's one of the reasons as a nomad, like we've started really going back to places we know, is because it helps, not from the standpoint that, like I know ahead of time, like, is the internet going to be okay? And I have a list of things, which is like, okay, I need decent Wi-Fi at home, I need a coffee shop nearby, and then I always have a phone I can tether to. So as a nomad, you build up your backup plans, right? Like just like backup data. Like I back up to a USB hard drive and I back up to the cloud. And sometimes I don't have enough bandwidth for the cloud, so I know I still got 2 backups, I'm safe. It's the same thing with internet. Like, okay, I've got internet at home. I know where I can go to a co-working space or a cafe. And worst case, I can tether to my phone and just use data on that. And that's more expensive, but at the end of the day, it's just a cost of living, and it's not bad most places. So the team is now 7 people. The company's 9 seeds. We always joke someday we'll get to 9. Usually we get to 8, and then things slow down and we lose a couple people. I do dream of getting bigger, but yeah, it's been 7 for a while now.
Do you think there's some benefits to being a bit of a smaller company?
I do, in that it lets us get kind of hands-on retail with our clients. It lets us be really involved. I think just in terms of the team we have, none of us are really great at managing large teams, like, or even very large projects. It takes a different scale and a different approach to things. And so I've always felt we have a bit of a sweet spot with what we do in terms of having enough depth that we're way better than a freelancer who, when they're gone, you can't reach them because it's just solo. And the depth and experience that comes from having 4 developers who have extensive experience across multiple things, without necessarily having the price tag that some of the very large agencies have to come in with because they just necessarily have a lot more overhead than we do. So that it's that sweet spot of like, we're not trying to compete for work on Upwork or Codable or platforms like that largely are geared towards freelancers and are great for those kind of one-off projects. But we're also somewhere below what you see from the crowd favorites and the human maids and the 10ups and the web devs, like the larger agencies that just necessarily have a bigger machine to them.
So it's interesting that you're remote, and our company is 100% remote. And I'm really I love talking to other company owners that do this. So are you guys able to have a culture being 100% remote? How do you interact? How do you collaborate? How do you have some kind of culture?
It's a challenge. I think having a small team means that like the team has enough personality of its own that there isn't an overwhelming dominant company culture. Part of our DNA has always been we're flex time. You work whenever you want. You kind of have to report in when you're working. Like we've learned that we can't just say, yeah, do whatever you want. But it works for people across time zones. I think that there's some advantage to that in that it forces us to be more structured in terms of that classic, like, say what you're going to do, make a plan for it, and then do it. And if you're handing that work off to someone, make a plan first. You can't just always be responding in the moment. And everyone knows that's never the best way to do it, right? Like it's always better to make a plan, have a goal, execute the plan, validate the goal, look back. Like those things, I think, are one of the advantages of remote teams is it forces you into that more so than I'm in the office today. Like I used to work in an office. I get it. You show up for work and sometimes you're like, I don't know what I'm to do today. I guess in a half hour or so, maybe I'll figure it out, or maybe by lunch or after I go to my coffee break. Like there's a far more need to establish and hold to that structure. But to the point of kind of company culture, we just like each other, have fun, like what we're doing. We love helping businesses with whatever they have, right? So I really have a soft spot for publishers. I think that's kind of the core of WordPress from where it came from. We do e-commerce, we do membership sites, we do lots of different things. But I have a soft spot for publishers and nonprofits too. And just anytime we can feel good about our clients, that kind of resonates. So.
It's really interesting what you're saying, that you being remote forces you to be a little more structured. And I've never heard that articulated. And I think that I'm kind of aware of what you're saying, but I've never spoken to anyone about it, because in our team, we have a similar thing where you can't just kind of wander around the office, give half the data to someone verbally, the rest of the data to them by email and so on. We use Slack to interact. And if you're handing something off, you have to kind of package it up into a structured set of ideas and data, and maybe to-dos, and give that to them. And if you don't do that and you're in Slack, it's kind of obvious, right?
Yeah. So we use, in terms of tools, we use Slack as well. We use it very little. Like 4 or 5 years ago when we started using it, we actually started with HipChat for chat before Slack. We used it a lot, and we use it less now because I've convinced everybody that you've got to document stuff in our project management tool, which we currently use Teamwork Projects, which we love. But it's that idea of like, when you're done for the day, you've got to document where you are. And it used to be really easy to be like, well, I'm working on this for a few days. And at the end of a few days, maybe somebody reported in, it's done. Like that was all that was said. And now there's a culture of a stand-up meeting in the morning. This is what I'm going to do today. Closure at the end of the day where you say, I got this much done and this is what I'm going to do tomorrow. And the remote nature and the need to document that and write it down as far as this is my goal, this is what I accomplished, these are what my blockers were, really I think helps the team overall. So it's that is one of the challenges as the owner, CEO, manager, all of that is I do feel like I'm constantly like pounding that into the team. Like anytime I see it, like I'll see it's done. Like, can you explain what that means? What happened? What'd you do? What was the cause? Like actually document stuff. And anytime we spend that time, and it's only 5 or 10 minutes to write that documentation in our project management tool, it really pays off. And where it pays off is even though it's only 1 out of 10 times, a week later, somebody else needs to see it. And this is that difference of like the freelancer who can keep everything in their mind versus a small team. At some point, somebody else on the team is going to pick it up. And it may not be expected, but someday a bug is found or something else, and you want to have that documentation to go back to. So again, it's that bookending of this is what I'm going to do, this is what I did, this is what I found, and I'm done, rather than just the word done.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I made that transition myself from being a team of 2 with me and Kerry, and essentially being a one-person development team, where there's zero communication overhead because you're just yourself and everything's happening inside of your head. And then you have to scale into a team, but you have to do that as a remote team. And so you're figuring out how to establish those communication channels and that ability to hand things off and make the organization scale, but you're also having to do it all remotely, as opposed to, we're all going to be in an office, so we don't even have to think about doing that because we can just communicate verbally. Right. And I think maybe it's a good thing because it forces you to be more intentional.
Exactly. It's that, like, I read a lot of the business development books and stuff, right? And right now I'm really thrilled with Cal Newport's Deep Work. Like, it had a huge effect on me. But every time I read any of these, it all goes back to Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. I'm like, everything you need to learn was in that book. And then, like, over the last 15 years, I've just reread it like 50 times, the same thing. And it's that whole idea of like beginning with the end in mind, right? Like, write it down, like what the goal is, and then execute it. Have intention, like you just said, the intentional aspect of it. And that's the remote nature makes you write it down, right? And it also eliminates a lot of that context switching and distractions. And Slack comes into this, but we've gotten pretty good about not randomly interrupting people at 10:48 a.m. with some Slack message that seems urgent. Like, if you prepare for it, like, you don't need to do that. Somebody's written it down the day before, you've made a plan, you've executed that, you've documented what somebody else needs to know, and you get more efficient that way. That's the hope most of the time.
my co-founder, who's standing behind the camera, has been really helpful in building a remote business, because when we would encounter challenges with, the team or certain team members or things like that, and they come along from time to time, and often it's just an issue of communication or something like that. But I would think about, well, is the structure, is it an issue with the team, or is it an issue with the way we're doing things? And she would kind of bring the conversation back to the leadership and point the finger at us and say, well, how can we be better?
Right.
And in many cases it was, well, we just need to plan ahead a little bit more, or we just need to be a little bit more organized.
Yeah.
And that's been, really, really, really helpful, because you end up not blaming the tools as much.
Yeah. There was a lot of time in our history where we were just looking for tools to fix things. No project management tool will ever fix your fundamental problems of communication and planning and that stuff. Like, it's a tool. It's not a cure-all. And we still come back to that regularly. Like, we're definitely flawed. Like, we're not perfect in the system. We've been doing it a long time where, like, I know I'm way better at catching things when they go off the rails and getting them back on than I was 8 years ago. Like, then it was like, it would be way off, but it ends up being communication and leadership, kind of setting expectations and goals and monitoring those and getting it all done. So, yeah.
Well, let me take a look at some of Kathy's questions here. Sure. So one of her questions is, how did you get started as an agency? I think you gave me a bit of your history.
Sure.
Do you want to talk about that some
Sure,
more?
happy to.
Yeah.
So it's worth saying, like, the origin of 9 Seeds, the agency, was 10 years ago this October. So we're about to celebrate our 10-year anniversary. But I wasn't part of the founding of the agency. At the time, I was founding my own little solopreneur freelancer agency called Jon Brown Studios, creatively enough, which had been doing photography and then got into web development for one of my photography clients. And about 2 years in, 9 Seeds hired me as a contractor for a while, and then invited me in to be a partner owner. And then a couple years later, or a year later, one of the other owners left, and I ended up becoming sole owner. So it's been this whole evolution. And in that, like, I went through the whole, how do you acquire a company and become a partner? How do you have a partner exit a company and go through all of that? And we were all friends, so it was all very amicable and reasonably discussed, and came to good terms on all of that stuff. And it's funny because anybody who's been in the WordPress space a long time knows, like, these things happen, but it's one of those things that a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs and agency owners in the space at least didn't used to talk about. Now there's enough of a peer network that you can get some good advice from people who are doing similar stuff in the service industry or in the product space. Like, well, how do these things get negotiated, and how do you value these companies and agencies and stuff? And the answer to a lot of that is you just make it up, because there aren't really good metrics for this stuff. But there are things to consider in that, in terms of, like, especially with partner exits, right? Is how much value is a partner who's exiting actually bringing to the business that's going to go away when they leave? And I've seen this happen to a few people, where somebody wants to cash out or leave an organization. It's like, well, that's great, but the value of the organization is really dependent upon what they're currently contributing. There isn't an intrinsic value that's going to continue after they leave. And it's one of the things I tell people. I'm like, it's one of the mistakes we made collectively. It wasn't like deceptively at all. Was really understanding how that would work, in terms of how that affected the overall revenue bottom line. That without these partners, like, the total revenue was going to go down because you didn't have people selling. So it changes. Like, there's lots of things to look at that aren't obvious unless you've been in it for a long time. So
yeah,
that was probably a lot more than you asked.
Well, no, but that is such an interesting conversation. I think something fairly dramatic has changed over the last decade and a half, and that is that entrepreneurs have better access to data in terms of how companies are formed, how shares are issued, the norms in terms of who gets how much, what the different classes of stock are, what it looks like if you raise funding, board structure, board
Right.
behavior, etiquette in all of those various roles, how businesses run. And the reason I mention that is because I know of several founders that I've spoken to where, to put it plainly, they got screwed in a big way. And these are folks that you probably know. And in most of those cases, in all of those cases that I can think of, those companies were formed around 2005-ish. And I think that there was this huge surge in the availability of data post '05. Especially with Y Combinator, publishing a lot of data online, other VCs blogging, and obviously they've got their own agenda,
Right.
but there's been this availability of data, and so it's less common now for someone who's not in San Francisco. Maybe they're in small town USA somewhere. They team up with a partner. They create a business. It's less common for someone to get a really bad deal because they just didn't have a really great lawyer advising them, because they don't need that as much. That you've got a lot of data that's available online now.
I think there's a caveat to that. I think you're right. There's a lot more data these days than there was, and Y Combinator, TechCrunch, all these things that document and advertise some of this stuff is more available. But like in the space that I'm in, and these small agencies are in, that are 2-person partnerships, have 10 employees, like it's a whole different scale. And a lot of that data is the startup world, right? It's people going through, venture capital, angel rounds, Series A, Series Bs, like. You can't really extrapolate that kind of data down to what is really a small business, lifestyle, mom and pop kind of thing. And that's really the challenge, is that most of the people I know who are running small agencies, who are freelancers, who've partnered and built up 5, 10, 15, 25 people, like that's not a high growth startup. Like I've done stuff in the startup world too, with startup weekends, and like looked at all of this, and like it's a very different attitude, right? Like there it's intended to be repeatable and high growth. And there's nothing repeatable or high growth about what 9 Seeds is. Like we build great websites for people. We build themes, we sell themes, we build plugins, we sell plugins. And most of what we do is build custom sites for medium and large businesses. But at the end of the day, like that's nothing that I'm looking to scale to 1 million customers, right? Like it's a very different, and so anyway, the point is there's very different algorithms you'd apply to the revenue and everything else as far as what reasonable growth is and what valuations are.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Agreed. What do you think differentiates 9 Seeds from other agencies?
Well, I think it's 2 things I mentioned a little bit earlier. Was I feel like we're in that middle ground, and I feel that there's a sweet spot there, and that we're big enough not to have the cons of being a freelancer or a 2-person shop, but also not the cons of being a 50 or 100-person shop, or even bigger. There's much larger agencies out there too that just aren't kind of labeled WordPress agencies. So for us, it's the depth of programming and skill and experience to advise clients and write good code and quality controlled code and secure code, hint, hint, that you get from a team that's been doing it for a long time. And so again, it comes down to that, like there's a higher quality delivered that's between those 2 extremes, I think.
What's your favorite kind of client?
Oh,
is that a good question?
The ones with lots of money. No. So we have a lot of good clients. We've, of course, had a few bad clients too. The ones who are comfortable enough spending money does make a difference, right? It's the ones who are like, okay, go ahead and do that. Like that, they see the value return, right? But we do a ton of membership sites, and we enjoy those. We do a ton of publisher sites, and I really enjoy those because part of me feels that like that was the original foundation of WordPress, right? Like WordPress origin was in self-publishing and democratizing publishing, and that is a really important thing in the world, is to give people the ability to publish online. There's a noble cause there, and I love when we get the opportunity to support that. So those are kind of our favorites. And we do e-commerce, but I shouldn't say this, but like I like our e-commerce clients. They're all good people. but I don't get excited about them because they're selling widgets. They're selling their thing that they're passionate about. It's easier to get excited about the publishers for sure.
Why do you think you're excited about publishers? Are you just interested in the dissemination of ideas, or?
Yeah, for sure. Like I love the idea of people being able to get the word out there, right? Whatever it is that part of it comes back to something that kind of got me down this path a long time ago, which was I've been a computer geek since about 1980, maybe 81. When I got my first computer as a little tiny kid, started programming in BASIC and then learned Logo and went through the whole spectrum, right? But not to go back to the whole origin story thing, but like through high school, the logical thing for me to do was get into computer programming. But I was also really outdoorsy and I didn't want to do what programming was in the 90s. It wasn't until laptops came into existence and mobile lifestyle became a thing that I really wanted to get into it. But that whole time, one of the things I've done ever since I was a little kid who helped my neighbor with their computer was making technology easier for other people. Like I get it's not in everyone's DNA to just kind of intuitively understand how software works and how computers work and when something breaks, what it likely is and how to fix it. And so part of it comes back to like our agencies always try to make technology easier for the client. And in particular, publishers aren't always the most technical. And when we get to help them with advertising and monetizing or making publishing easier so that they just write and get stuff published, I love that aspect of it, of making technology easier for everybody. And I think that's one of the places where WordPress started, was it was an amazing platform that allowed people to easily publish online. I think that there's a flip side of that, that I think WordPress is suffering from it's not as easy as it once was. And you and I talked about this briefly the other day, was it's just gotten really complicated for a lot of site owners to manage their sites in the dashboard with admin notices galore and plugin updates and worrying about security and all of these multiple features. We're still the technology experts who can help people with that. But look, of our 7 people, it's hard for us to manage all of the information that's out there that goes into it, where it used to be a lot simpler, kind of with less concerns, with less like, I have to know 17 things to do this now. Like,
So you think WordPress has become more complex,
much.
and that's become a barrier to publishing?
Absolutely. I think it's become a barrier to clients using WordPress or choosing WordPress. And I think that's one of the things that we're having a conversation about these days in the WordPress community, is how do we gain that back? And in some ways, Gutenberg is targeting that, right? It's adding the feature set that other platforms like Wix and Squarespace, as examples, provides in terms of a richer editing set that lets them create richer content. And I think that's really important. I was someone who, very vocal in the community, was pretty vocally against the user experience of Gutenberg early on, but never against like the idea of it. I just thought it could be better designed, easier to use, less complicated. I think it's the right solution, and I think it's come a long, long way. I'm totally on the Gutenberg train at this point. But there are other parts of WordPress that I think have gotten overly complicated and harms people. Like, look, years ago, we would tell clients, if you can use Gmail, you can use WordPress. And there was some truth to that. Like, this is 10 years ago, there was some truth. Like, it's just like using Gmail. You just get into the web interface. It's a SaaS thing, like webby thing. You type your content and you can use it. And now it's hard to tell people that same thing. It's like, well, if you can use Gmail, you can write a post. But there's a lot more to WordPress than writing a post, right? There's updating your plugins, there's choosing plugins, there's theme updates, there's security concerns, there's dealing with the admin notices that are asking you who knows what. Like, in our case, like, we're between that client who we're trying to make the technology easier for, and the software which we're trying to manage, and answering questions like, well, what does this admin notice mean? Do I need to update this? If I update this, will it break? And there's definitely a lot more anxiety by site owners than there was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, site owners felt comfortable with WordPress, and I think today they feel less comfortable with WordPress.
It feels like, to me, the reason that happened is twofold. The one is that there are a lot of interested parties, vendors specifically, that are trying to make a living out of WordPress. And so, some of those admin notices that you mentioned, and we chatted about this over coffee the other day, are not necessarily urgent and are a little bit self-serving in the case of some vendors, and that's added some complexity. And then it feels like the other reason WordPress might have gotten more kind of unwieldy is because it's serving a bigger market. So it's trying to solve more problems for more different kinds of people. And so it used to be a blogging platform, and then it evolved into a content management system, and then it evolved into, in addition to that, an e-commerce platform. And it's now doing all of those things along with a couple of others. And so if you're just doing one of those things, and especially if you're just publishing, you just want to run a blog, there's kind of all that other complexity that comes with it, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I think that, like, I had a conversation with Matt Mullenweg that I'll never forget. It was after WordCamp Vancouver, Buddy Camp, developers camp up there like 10, 12 years ago. And it was at the time where he's like, there was a conversation in the WordPress community about WordPress being a CMS as opposed to a blogging platform. And I remember, like, we were all like, you need to sell your clients that it's a CMS. It's not just a blogging platform. And we would defend WordPress relentlessly, like it's more than just a blogging platform. I'm not building you a WordPress site, I'm building you a content management site. And at that time, we had this conversation.
What year was that? That was like 2010, 2007,
yeah,
2012, kind of in that window?
2010-ish.
Yeah.
I'm really bad with dates.
Yeah.
I joke that I have a really bad concept of time and space. That's why I travel. But no, it was around was it 2010, 2012?
It was in that window from like 2007 to 2012, where at some point there was this inflection point where WordPress and the community and the leadership decided it was also going to be a CMS.
Right.
And I think that's probably a good thing because it opened up a big market.
Sure.
But I also remember that.
It was the birth of custom post types, right? Like, we finally had the ability to kind of do custom data modeling of where you're like, oh, I don't just have a post, I can have custom fields attached to it, and it can handle more data than just posts and pages. But the point of it was, I was talking to Matt, and I was saying at the time, I'm like, look, I'm trying to figure out where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years. As a business owner, like, that's what you need to be thinking about. It's not what WordPress can do today, it's where is this all going to be in 5 or 10 years? Because if we're going off a cliff, I need to turn and find something else, because it's my livelihood. I've still got 30 or 40 more years before I retire. I need to be thinking down the road, and it's not something I ever had to worry about in engineering. Like, civil engineering was going to be civil engineering for another 50 years. Like, I knew that roadmap, right? But the web and WordPress and being an agency owner is very dynamic and always changing, and you've got to be looking down that road. Now, what Matt was saying at the time was, like, he's like, WordPress is already CMS. What I'm wondering about is when it becomes a framework or an operating system of the web. And it was the first time he said that, and, like, to his credit, like 10 years later, it's happening. Like, I can criticize Matt about a few things, but one of the things I'm always amazed by is he is doing that, looking 10, 20 years down the road kind of thing, really well. And with that, like, at this point, like, I'm looking at it, and, like, WordPress has gotten complicated. Is it time to turn, or is there a path forward? And that's not a decision you ever make with 100% certainty. But part of me is, like, really getting vocal about the fact that WordPress has gotten more complicated, and we need to figure out how to get back to those roots of anyone can own and manage this site. It doesn't require a team of developers. It doesn't even require one developer. Like, your average site owner ought to be able to manage the notifications, the advertisements, and all that stuff without feeling overwhelmed and anxious about their site. Because once they do, they find another solution that doesn't make them feel that way. And those solutions are Squarespace and Wix and Shopify and all of these competitors. So I think, I do think Gutenberg's the right path. I do think that there are things we need to worry about and build into core and that, because even if you think about what you were describing, right, is that WordPress now services very diverse markets, right? You service the e-commerce market, and that may be WooCommerce, or it might be Ninja Shop, or BigCommerce, or Shopify integrations, or there's all these things. like all of those things still need a solid core. And that solid core is where I like to focus my attention, so to speak, in terms of the community and building core and contributing is like, how do we make sure that that's really good for users? Whether they're publishers or e-commerce or membership sites or, like we built private intranet sites on WordPress. It gets used for everything, and rightly so. It's easily extensible. I think you made a really good point that one of the reasons it's gotten really complicated is there's so much commerce going on in the space. There's these competing interests of like, SEO plugins that are popping up notices about their thing, and then pop-up plugins that are popping up notices about their pop-up plugins, like e-commerce plugins that are popping up their upsells. And like, I use the joke, I'm like, the dashboard shouldn't look like Times Square. It shouldn't just be constant billboard advertisements everywhere. No one wants that. Like, the reason we're self-hosting and own it is we want control over our own stuff. And nobody wants advertisements all over the screen. But it's important to note that it's not just advertisements, right? It's admin notices that are updates. Like, most plugins shouldn't be getting an update every 2 days. Like, if your plugins are getting updated in 2 days, it's poorly written and poorly managed. Like, our themes get updates every couple months, and it's usually for some new feature. Like, we had to update them for PHP 7.2 or GDPR notices. But like, needless updates every 2 weeks or every 2 days just frustrates users. It's not a good experience.
There's some interesting reasons why plugin authors do that. A few years ago, the search algorithm in the plugin repository would look at the number of recent downloads, I think it was. And so there was a strong incentive to release an update every week or two, because it would goose your download count and it would make you appear more prominent in the search results. And I think this goes back quite a ways. It's probably 2013, 2014, something like that. And so the reason for a frequent update had nothing to do with the users or the software.
No, that's exactly true. And I remember it was a race between Yoast SEO and All-in-One SEO for a while, where I'm like, they literally both those two were releasing updates almost every day. And it was because that was the counter. The counter was based on how many downloads and updates. So if you released an update every day, it totally juiced your ratings. That's no longer true. But it's not just true of plugins that we get from the .org plugin directory. It's also true of commercial plugins that are getting updated from other sources that we pay for. And I always find it funny. I'm like, I'm paying $100, $200, $500 a year for some plugins that are then causing me a management headache because they're updating too often, needlessly. It's not a critical security update or anything like that. It's just like, oh, we changed the letter on this one admin page because we had a typo. I'm like, why would you release that as an update? I get it. You had a typo, but you just made 100,000 people update their sites.
Can you, this might be too self-evident to even need to describe, but can you articulate why frequent updates are a problem for you? I mean, specifically, what work does that create for you as an agency that is running customer sites?
So on our customer sites, some of them we do test updates and do real user testing before updates. But even whether it's as an agency or a site owner, it's work. Like, it requires somebody updating it, and it's risk. Every update, no matter how big or small, carries some risk of something breaking. And so every time you update, even if it's like, I've got to look at a changelog, right? I've got to look at a changelog that says typo change on this page. Okay, I'm just going to hit the update button. I'm not going to pre-test it. I trust that the changelog's accurate. That's still time and energy that I'm going to expend on updating that site. Now, we do maintenance for a bunch of clients, and we do all of their updates on Mondays. Like, we batch them. But every Monday, there are 20, 30 plugins to update on each site. It's a lot of extra work, right? And it's one of those things that makes WordPress harder to manage than other platforms. If I'm telling a client, yeah, well, we've got to update 20 plugins every week on your site, they understand that, and they'll pay me for that. But at the end of the day, my concern is they'll switch to a platform where they don't have to pay anybody to do that because there's no plugins to update, because the other platform just continuously distributes this stuff and continuously tests it in a way that we can't for the sites, the self-hosted sites that are unique. And that's the beauty of WordPress, right? The sites are unique, right? You can cobble together your own plugins to make exactly what you need in a way that you can't with some of these big platforms. We run into it all the time. Well, I want to use this ticketing system. Well, you can't, because you can't install that on Shopify. Oh, I want to use this thing. Well, you can't, because you can't install that on whatever. So
it's interesting. What you're describing there seems like a real Achilles heel for WordPress because, and I want to chat about this in a bit more detail, but Chris, who his interview will probably have run the week before we're going to run this interview. We were chatting. They use Squarespace for Black Mountain Coffee, and one of the reasons they went over to Squarespace is they didn't need to hire a developer, they didn't need to hire someone to maintain the site. But I hadn't thought of the fact that plugin updates and maintaining the list of plugins that a site runs, making sure they're updated, making sure they're secure, is a significant amount of work. And if you have a commercial platform like Squarespace or Wix or something like that, there's a commercial team in a building somewhere, or maybe they work remotely, but they are updating that entire platform along with all its capabilities, which are really the equivalent of WordPress plugins. Right. They're keeping that up to date, and they're running through some QA process and presumably some security process as well. And for WordPress, yeah, it comes with all the freedoms of WordPress and so on, but you need to either maintain that yourself or you need someone else to do it. And to be honest, a lot of that plugin code doesn't run through QA often. Right. It's just one guy that made the plugin and releases it.
Yeah, it's a good point. And that's the concern there, is at some point the small businesses that were using WordPress 10 years ago aren't anymore. And look, WordPress powers 30% of the web. It's not struggling. But if it wants to get to 50, it's got to regain those people who, I don't think it's just the user interface of Squarespace, Wix, whatever. I think it's also the maintenance cost and the maintenance anxiety, right? Like 99% of the time hitting that update button on a plugin is just fine. But there's 1% where it isn't. And the site owner, in this case, isn't equipped to fix the problems that happen. So why not avoid that? I think that with WordPress 5.2, which is coming out in a week or two, there are some really, people haven't talked about them. Like people talk about Gutenberg, but in 5.2, there's some really good features that are dealing with 500 errors. If a site crashes, you don't just get a white screen, that deal with PHP updates. The new health check plugin is amazing. I think that it's interesting. I pay attention to these things, but I don't hear about them very widely. And those are actually really good features that are coming to WordPress that I think address some of what I'm talking about. Maybe not all of it, but at least addressing some of the issues with I hit update and now the site crashed. Because that's a lot less likely from this point forward with 5.2 coming out shortly, and probably after this airs, than it was a few weeks ago. So,
yeah, and I know our QA lead for WordFence, Matt Rusnak, has been looking very closely at 5.2 and specifically that feature where it better manages 500 errors. And I think he identified some issues with that. And this is going back months, but Matt's been collaborating with some folks on WordPress Slack about that. And so it might be interesting to have him on the show to kind of go into a bit more depth about how that evolved and where it ended up. Yeah. But I know that he's been paying a lot of attention to that. We've been chatting, we've been bashing WordPress a little bit because that's what we do, because we love it and we want it to get better.
It has created an amazing life for me. It's great for my clients. I love WordPress. We don't, I tell clients who come to us looking for things that aren't WordPress, I'm like, 99% of what we do is WordPress. Everything we do is PHP or JavaScript. And occasionally we'll do things that are kind of into Laravel, kind of into over here. I'm like, if it touches WordPress, we are delighted to do it. And we still think it's an amazing platform. It's just you've got to identify the warts and the moles and remove them and fix them, because that's better for the ecosystem overall.
I think that we were chatting about the work overhead of updating plugins and the risk associated with that. And the hosting market has evolved over the last, 20 plus years, right? Where more recently we've had more full service hosts sort of more of a white glove product appear. I think WP Engine was one of the leaders there. Liquid Web is another one. And there's a few others, and I do apologize to the hosts that are watching this for not mentioning them.
The original one was Pagely, and they deserve a shout out.
Right. Yeah, well done. And do you think that they've solved some of that problem of helping keep sites up to date and maintained, and vetting code that gets deployed on sites before it's deployed for security and robustness and that kind of thing?
I think they've helped, but it's hard to say that they've helped with testing code and securing sites in that way, because they don't really test code or plugins, right? We are somewhat host agnostic. We have a partnership thing with WP Engine, which is where we have most of our clients, but we have them all over the place. And I will say that these managed WordPress hosts have stepped up support dramatically. Like the difference in support you get when, as a WordPress professional, someone who knows what's going on, contact support via live chat or phone or email, what you get back from those companies in terms of support is orders of magnitude better than what you used to get with the budget, shared hosting, cPanel-based hosting, that kind of thing. And I think that has helped customers overwhelmingly across the board. But at the end of the day, they're doing some plugin vulnerability scanning, like known exploits or known issues. They're doing some security, brute force protection, DDoS protection, stuff like that. But it's not like they're looking at anyone's plugins and themes and looking for cross-site scripting vulnerabilities or any of these things that do come up, at least not in any kind of bulk way. Like every once in a while, one of these comes out. I think WordFence does one of the best jobs. There's 3 or 4 others out there now that are actively reporting on vulnerabilities and scanning plugins and talking about them, and reporting them back to plugin authors responsibly and all of this. And it's interesting, just today came up an issue with one of the vulnerability companies out there basically objecting to WordPress.org's forum moderators not forwarding vulnerability reports and not publishing them. So there's still work for us to do in this industry, but I think the hosts do a lot, but I don't think they're necessarily the right people or can do it all. And so in that way, the WP Engines, the Pagely's, the Liquid Webs, all of these SiteGround, managed WordPress hosts, like they help for sure. But the WordPress ecosystem is still pretty turbulent and choppy because it just is by nature. Yeah, I'm not sure who could watch it all. Yeah.
It seems like the hosts and the agencies fill that gap. And if actually this kind of brings up an interesting point, because in chatting with agencies about Gutenberg, and I think it was more individual developers as well, folks that are creating sites for others, they were a little bit worried that Gutenberg was going to put them out of a job. It seemed like there was like a conflict of interest there, because some of the capabilities that Gutenberg brought online are things that traditionally an agency or a developer would do for a customer, and now the customer can do it themselves. Did you have a sense of that at all, or?
A little bit. I mean, I feel for my friends who run Beaver Builder and Elementor and some of these page builders. Like, I think they're the ones who see a dramatic competition from Gutenberg. I also think they're in a good position to pivot, because the modules that they provided, the custom modules that now become custom blocks, I think still have great value to site owners. So I think that there is a path forward for those page builder companies. Conversely, like the agencies, sure, Gutenberg lets them do certain layout formatting things that maybe they would hire an agency to write a little bit of HTML code for. But that was never very high-skilled work. No offense to the agencies doing it. I hate saying these things this way, but like that's the bottom end of the web development spectrum is, well, I can float your image left. Like Gutenberg isn't magically doing this stuff. Like it's one of the things that us at 9seeds have always done is like we're about functionality, about business process. I tell people, I'm like, we're not really a design or marketing agency. We're a development agency. When you want to get from A to B and like process data and connect to APIs and things like that, like that's where I think that the high skilled work comes in and where the value is. The value of I made you a sales page, unless you have knowledge of how to do that really well and write good copy, I think some of those things have high skill, high value rewards. But like laying out a sales page or a landing page, I don't think that that is ever going to be a long-term high skilled thing that has high value to the customer, right? And at worst, Gutenberg makes it easier for you to do your job. Like if you were building these landing pages, then the value you're bringing to it really is in writing good sales copy and laying it out really well to convert and doing A/B testing on it and these things. And you just have another tool to build it. I don't think that the skill of building it, like which is essentially an HTML table or a couple divs and floats, is where the value came from. So.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Yeah, interesting. So if you were talking to the WordPress leadership right now, you know, Matt and the folks that kind of steer the ship, what would you want to see in WordPress? What changes would you like?
So it's interesting. There was talk at WordCamp US about governance, right? This is a huge topic in the community. It's I feel it's important, but it's also kind of esoteric and it's led by some people. And I won't get too much into that other than saying that for years I've been saying, I trust Matt's leadership of the project overall. Don't want to say that I don't, but I've never felt like it has good product leadership. Like the product itself, WordPress, doesn't have module owners that really own it. Like Gutenberg kind of does at this point. Like I know the people who are in charge of that and are leading it forward, but it feels like there ought to be a product lead for the editor. There ought to be a product lead for the plugins who oversees it year after year, like a product lead council, not just the core developers. WordPress has always been developed on a release by release basis. And there's some good stuff about that, but it also really limits what you can accomplish because you can't really string 4 or 5 big releases together and be like, the editor has evolved from point A to Z over 3 years. It's, well, we added this one big feature in 5.0. And there ought to be somebody who's like, owns the dashboard, who just feels like I am the product lead for keeping the dashboard overall great. I'm the product lead for keeping the customizer great. And for a while, those were the lead developers, but it's not necessarily the same person writing the code who should be leading the vision for the product. And so right after WordCamp US 2018, Matt appointed Josepha as executive director and Yoast in charge of marketing. And I think that's a great step forward. But I think there should be a team of 5 people, 10 people that own different pieces of it and really represent like that overall product movement forward. So that's it. I've said it a bunch of times in different forums, but that's what I really think needs to happen. And it's not just about like the WP governance project that Rachel Cherry and Morton and a couple others are working on, I think is a good exploration. Not opposed to it, not 100% behind it. I think the thing is that it approaches it from like the user standpoint, which I think is important, right? It goes back to the democratizing publishing and how are we serving users in terms of accessibility and diversity and some really important issues. But I always look at it and I'm like, who's leading the product vision? Like who is, besides Matt, who I think, like I said, has done a great job, but who is owning individual pieces of WordPress in a way that is, I'm going to make this one thing better over the next year or two. And I don't see that. And I think we need that. I think product leadership becomes a thing and product leadership of individual components, right? So somebody can take the dashboard, somebody can take plugins, and not just do incremental updates, but have a big arcing overall vision to each of those pieces.
What's your gotta-have tool or process that makes life easier?
It's ironic. Like I admittedly have always struggled with kind of focus and like having my stuff together. And I've looked for tools for 30 years. And the gotta-have thing is a pad of paper. There is literally nothing that works for me other than a bullet list, kind of a quasi bullet journal, but I don't have the pretty bullet journal, right? It's very very crunchy. If I don't write it down and have it sitting there, I get easily distracted. So the gotta have thing is definitely a notebook that I write things in. And this comes from someone who has been as digital and technical as anybody his entire life. I was that kid at like 10 years old. I had a Sharp Wizard, like the very first PDA thing. Like I wanted everything always to be digital. And I think 5 or 6 years ago, I finally gave up. It was like, the only thing that works is a pad of paper and a pen. And my handwriting's awful. It's ugly as sin. Like, I can't show it to people because it's just embarrassing. But that pad of paper is what runs my whole life at this point, and took a long time to really adopt. But that's the thing. Yeah. There was a thing recently that came up. Dre's Gerhardt, I never say his name right, from Drupal, the founder of Drupal, recently wrote a post about kind of how the Drupal community fosters open source contribution, and that it's not really egalitarian because you have to be pretty privileged to have the free time to contribute in a volunteer basis to any project. And it really got me thinking, like, WordPress especially, WordPress way bigger than Drupal at this point, but we ought to be looking at these other open source projects and learning from them. And it's not to say that the way WordPress is doing it is wrong, just we can always do better. And one of those things was kind of really resonates with me, which is, how do you get more people to contribute to WordPress? And I hear people who will say like, oh, I contribute 30 hours a week to WordPress. And I'm like, and I don't get paid for it. I'm like, well, that's great, but you chose to do that. Like, you can't contribute and then look back and be like, well, I deserve something for this, right? It's volunteering at the end of the day. But how do you continue to foster this such that we still have a broad spectrum of people contributing, and you're not just getting the big web hosts to pay people to contribute, not just a few automaticians who are paid to contribute. I think it's great that, Matt had this thing, 5 for the Future, years ago, with the idea that people in the WordPress space should try, if they can, to dedicate 5% of their time back to the core project. And so some agencies said, well, we'll put 1 of 5 people on the project full time. Or others said, well, we'll all take Friday off once a month and the whole team will contribute, kind of thing. And I think those are great initiatives and movements. But we need to really look at how to continue to expand that, to get people who maybe aren't backed by large companies in the space to feel not just that they have the time to contribute, but that their contributions get heard. Because this is one of the things I see is that there are a lot of people who are really passionate about WordPress. I am. And I can't contribute 30 hours a week because I'm trying to make a living 50 hours a week. And so while I'm passionate and I have a voice, I don't always feel that voice gets heard. But this leads into something else. This is going to be, a bit scatterbrained. Like, no one has a right in the WordPress ecosystem to be heard, per se. They do have a right to speak, to vocalize their opinions. But at the end of the day, like, you've got to be passionate about it enough and dedicated enough to get people to listen. And so there's this, I don't know the right word for it. It's still a nascent thought in my head, right? But there's this tipping point between, like, I'm going to advocate for something vocally and I'm going to lead people forward. And those are different things, right? Like, you've got to advocate for the things you believe. But at the end of the day, you've also got to take a leadership position to not just speak it, but to lead others towards it if it's really important for you. And so this comes into play in terms of accessibility, in terms of internationalization, in terms of all of the things we talk about, right? Like, we have voices advocating for things, but we need to support those people to not just advocate, but to become leaders that then collect more energy behind it and contribute in ways that are positive and move everything forward. I don't know if any of that makes sense. I know it's kind of rambling.
What do you think the difference is between leadership and advocacy?
So I think for me, the difference is advocacy is saying what needs to be said and advocating for a point. Leadership is convincing 10 people of that thing and then getting 10 people in line to work on that thing. And it's one thing to say, like, a good example is I was an advocate that I thought Gutenberg's user experience was poor in the early days of Gutenberg as a plugin. Like, that was advocacy. I think this could be better. I think this could be better. But I never really took the step to get 10 people on my side to contribute to Gutenberg, right? And that's the difference. Like, I recognize that was advocacy. It wasn't leadership. And it's really hard when I don't have the hours myself, and recognize this, right? I didn't have the hours to invest in becoming a leader to get other people to contribute or to contribute myself, right? Like, all I could do was raise the flag, wave the flag, and hope that people would listen. And so there's this point in the community where community leaders and people with power, with some of that, need to recognize when that's happening and figure out how to pull those people who are just advocating up and into more leadership, where and it's not putting them in a position of leadership, it's nurturing them to develop into a position of leadership. I don't know if it makes sense how that's a little bit different, but it's not just like, all right, well, you're in charge of module A. That doesn't really help. It's, I'm going to mentor you to the point where you're going to have some people to work with you who share your vision and will work towards an end goal, right? And so I see that as one of the big challenges community-wise to helping move things forward.
Thanks very much to Jon for chatting with me. You can find him on Twitter at JB510, and his agency is 9 Seeds, and you can find them at the number 9, the word seeds.com. You can follow Kathy Zant on Twitter at Kathy Zant. You can find me on Twitter at MMAUNDER or Maunder. If you're watching this on YouTube, don't forget to like and subscribe if you want to get alerted to the latest episodes that we post. Thank you very much for watching. Have a wonderful rest of your week. Bye, everyone.